Good evening. Welcome to the October 2025 presentation of the Bay Area Culinary Historians. Tonight, we are pleased to have Pat Saperstein join us to speak on Lunching on the Lot, How the Golden Age Stars Ate at Hollywood Studios. Pat Saperstein is deputy editor at Variety, where she covers movies, TV, vintage Hollywood, and restaurants. She has written about restaurants for the Los Angeles Times, Los Angeles Magazine, and more, and was co-author of the books Eat Los Angeles and Drink Los Angeles, and Can, 50 Years of Sun, Sex, and Celluloid. A native of Los Angeles, she never tires of exploring Southern California and points beyond. So please join us in welcoming Pat Saperstein.
Hi, welcome to Lunching on the Lot. Thank you so much for joining today, and thank you for the nice introduction. So we're going to talk a little bit about the golden age of Hollywood studio commissaries, and we'll hear about how even though commissaries still exist at the major studios are all starting to merge together for one thing, but also the commissaries are just not the same kind of places for meeting and greeting stars and photographing stars that they were in sort of the 30s through the 60s were really the golden age of Hollywood and the golden age of commissaries as well. I've been an editor at Variety for more than 2 decades, and I started LA's first food blog, Eating LA. I grew up eating at one of Hollywood's favorite studio adjacent restaurants, the Smokehouse, because my dad's animation studio, UPA, was located right across the parking lot. But it wasn't until I was older and I started writing for Variety that I was occasionally invited to lunch at the studios. Frankly, a lot of the food wasn't that memorable, but there was a time when the studio eateries were buzzing, with everyone from Joan Crawford to Cary Grant ordering dishes like foie gras and oyster stew. So let's take a look back at the golden age of studio commissaries. From the earliest days of Hollywood, studio workers and movie crews needed to be fed on the lots. But before the big studios were built, lunches were catch and catch can. Workers ate at nearby cafes, at makeshift craft service stations, or at modest studio lunch spots. Universal was the first studio that was built in 1915, and it was followed by Warner Brothers, Paramount, Fox, MGM, and later Disney, plus many that don't exist today, like Hal Roach Studios. What I find interesting about this golden age of Hollywood is the juxtaposition of early movie making, the biggest stars in the world, and the way the studios needed to cater to them by offering both workaday employee cafeterias and glamorous exclusive restaurants with sometimes exotic dishes and huge menus. These menus also show the history of food through the 20th century and beyond, from flannel cakes to venison pate and peaches with burrata. In 2004, Variety, where I work, wrote a cover story looking back at the glory days, which started off, the commissary was a mandatory destination where ideas, stories, and gossip were traded. Even 19 years ago, it was already past the commissary's heyday. These days, fewer productions are made on the lots, and many of the studio employees who aren't working at home prefer to eat in their offices. One of the big differences is that the stars are never photographed at studios anymore. You'll still find executives and occasional actors using the executive dining rooms, but you'll never see a photo of a star eating there. Nowadays, photo ops come on red carpets, not in dining rooms, and there's a lot less schmoozing from table to table. So let's take a tour of the major studios and look at who was there and what they ate. We'll start with Fox, which built its huge Century City lot in 1928. Fox built its first commissary on the Pico Boulevard lot in 1929, with actors Will Rogers helping launch the restaurant as part of the promo for his movie They Had to See Paris. It was called the Café de Paris. Co-star Fifi Dorset, a Quebecois starlet named Yvonne, who actually had never visited France, was also on hand. It was called the Café de Paris, and it was modeled after the cafes of the Bois de Boulogne in Paris. It was and is famous for its beautiful Art Deco murals, which you can still see today if you happen to get invited to the lot. Fox is the only vintage studio commissary that's still more or less intact from how it was when it was built. The murals depicting movie stars and world capitals were added in 1932, and they were designed by art director Haldane Douglas, an Oscar nominee for his film For Whom the Bell Tolls. The murals are still there, and they're the only part of a studio original commissary that still exists, although Fox has moved most of its operations to the Disney lot, so you're not likely to get invited there in any case unless you're working on a production that's going on right at that very moment. They're still using the studio for sound stages, but just as rental stages. Stars who had 10 hits for Fox got their portraits painted on the Wall of Stars, which was part of the beautiful Art Deco murals. During World War II, there was understandably a lot of anti-German sentiment, so the Berlin part of the mural was painted over and replaced with Athens, the birthplace of Fox's studio head Spiros Skouras. Probably the biggest thing that ever happened at any studio commissary was when Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, dined at the Fox commissary in 1959 on his North American tour. Everybody who was anybody wanted to go, but it was in so much demand, no extra guests were allowed. Ronald Reagan and Bing Crosby turned down the invitation because they thought they might be seen as being too close to communism. But Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Judy Garland, Tony Curtis, Kirk Douglas, Zsa Zsa Gabor, and Henry Fonda were just a few of the big names on the star-studded guest list. The biggest name was Marilyn Monroe, whom Skouras begged to come, though her leftist husband Arthur Miller was not invited. The studio also asked if she would wear something tight, black, and sexy. "You're a very lovely young lady," Skouras said, smiling. Later, or I think maybe that was Khrushchev that said that. Later, Monroe said about Khrushchev, "He looked at me the way a man looks at a woman." The dignitaries and stars dined on shrimp, squab, wild rice, Parisian potatoes, and peas with pearl onions. But word came down in the middle of the lunch that Khrushchev wouldn't be able to go to Disneyland as he had intended due to security concerns. So he spent much of his 45-minute-long speech complaining about not getting to visit Disneyland. He was taken to see the set of the movie Can-Can, but he proclaimed it pornographic. Some of the other stars seen at Fox include John Wayne with Jane Mansfield, who you can see on the left, Elvis Presley with Linda Padgett, who you see at the bottom, Linda Darnell, who is seen serving herself while commissary workers were on strike during World War II, in a stage publicity shot, of course. And at the top, we have Liza Minnelli, it looks like. Former studio head Sherry Lansing reminisced, "I remember we had a board meeting in the commissary. There was former President Gerald Ford, Henry Kissinger, and Grace Kelly. Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon came to the lunch. We sat at a round table and there was silence. And then Walter Matthau said, 'President Ford, I have something that I've always wanted to ask you.' He said, 'Of course, Walter, what is it?' He said, 'Could you please pass the cookies?' I guess that was a joke that might have played better at the time. Other presidents who visited included Franklin Roosevelt, Truman, and JFK. So that was really one of the starriest commissaries at Fox. Here's some of the china from the Café de Paris, which you can buy on eBay to this day. As far as the food, Tyrone Power was said to favor the ox joints, while Betty Grable liked escargot and baba au rhum. They brought in the chef named Nick Janios from the Brown Derby, who had invented the Cobb salad. He was at Fox from 1934 to 1971, quite a long run, and he would make cream chicken on toast for Shirley Temple with peas. Restaurant writer and producer Jerry Weston reviewed the commissary in 1994 for Variety, and he wrote, "I remember that in the early 80s, for one brief glorious moment, the executive dining room here was the single best studio eatery in Hollywood. The only menu that I could find from the Café de Paris was undated, but it advertises frozen yogurt, the great new taste treat, so it must be from the early 80s. There's also ratatouille, a tostada grande, and a traditional Monte Cristo sandwich. They also had dishes named after movies, like the Boston Strangler sandwich, which was actually an ABLT, an avocado, bacon, lettuce, and tomato. Many of the studios used films or film stars to name items on their menu, and we'll see a lot more fun ones of those at other studios. Now we come to MGM. So MGM had some of the biggest stars on the Culver City lot. On the right, you can see the young cast of Little Women in 1948, including Janet Leigh, June Allison, and Elizabeth Taylor wearing their nightgowns, because stars would often run over to the commissary, have a quick lunch while they were in costume, and run back to the set. On the left, you can see Elizabeth Taylor's chipmunk, Nibbles. She wrote in her book, Nibbles and Me, that when she brought him to the commissary, the head of publicity called the young star into his office and said, "You know, pets are not allowed in the commissary, but we will make an exception because Nibbles is so well behaved." I guess when Elizabeth Taylor wants to bring a chipmunk, nobody is going to turn her down. Former Variety editor and Paramount executive Peter Bart remembered lunching frequently with Roddy McDowall at MGM, who would reminisce about when he and Elizabeth Taylor and the other youngsters were teenagers, and they'd go from their classrooms to the set and then to the commissary in full makeup. Joan Crawford, seen on the left, was usually on a diet, and she was said to eat only crackers and coffee, except when she was hosting her family at the commissary, where she led them in prayer, as she was a devout Christian Scientist. She didn't mind taking her dog, despite the rule that was apparently broken for the studio's top moneymakers. And there's Liz Taylor again on the right, making a trip into the kitchen to taste dishes. Here's one of the earliest photos from a Hollywood commissary of Marion Davies eating with a cowboy and clown at MGM in 1935. And there's Kirk Douglas in 1962, taking a break from filming The Hook, eating what was called the How the West Was Won spectacular fruit salad. In the early days of the studio, Louis B. Mayer had the chefs learn to make his mother's famous chicken soup with matzo balls. He was worried that the workers would find their way to Culver City bars at lunchtime and never return, and so that's why he wanted the menu to be just right at the studio commissary. The MGM commissary was designed by Oscar-winning art director Cedric Gibbons and could sit 225 people. It was famous for the chicken soup, and the head chef had to shadow Louis B. Mayer's film editor and assistant Margaret Booth so that he could replicate her recipes that Mayer liked. Lionel Barrymore had exclusive bacon that no one else could eat, according to Mayer's biography. John Barrymore had his own coffee brand, and Wallace Beery never tipped because tips were reserved for special service. And as a famous movie star, he always got special service, so it was viewed as a waste of money. I don't think that attitude would fly today, especially with a rich Hollywood star. Lon Chaney was the only person who ordered the steak tartare, according to a news report. MGM was good at pushing its own stars. The beautifully illustrated menu from the 1950s featured the Elizabeth Taylor salad, the Sid Charisse salad, and our own Mexican enchilada, complete with Parmesan cheese. On the back of the menu, it was signed by everyone from Leslie Caron to Roger Moore, Debbie Reynolds, Gene Kelly, and Grace Kelly. By 1957, the menu was quite abbreviated, though you could still get beef kidneys, which must have fallen out of fashion soon after. I didn't find a lot of photos of the interior of the MGM commissary, but you can see a fascinating recreation in the 1937 version of A Star is Born. The story goes that David O. Selznick first told art director Lyle Wheeler that he wanted a very realistic workday commissary, nothing fancy. But when Selznick saw the set, he changed his mind and decided he wanted the Cedric Gibbons glamorous modern design that had just been installed at the studio. I'm not sure why they couldn't have just filmed in the commissary, but they recreated the whole thing on a soundstage, and you can see the great deco lighting fixtures and the chrome chairs, just like the ones Gibbons had selected for the real commissary. And it was filmed in beautiful Technicolor, even though it was only 1937. So Wheeler, the art director Wheeler recalled, I used that as the model and used a lot of glass brick, which was just then coming in, and big circle windows so that you could see people going by. We tore the old one down in 10 minutes, he recalled, and then they worked all night long to build the new, fancier commissary for the scene in A Star is Born. Now we move on to Disney. At Disney's earlier studio on Hyperion Avenue, they didn't have a commissary, and they often ate at the Tam O'Shanter restaurant on Los Feliz Boulevard, which we'll get to later. But after Disney made a lot of money with Snow White, they moved over the hill and built a bigger studio, which opened in 1939. The commissary was in the same building they use today. There was also a cafe in the animation building, which was more of a tea room for the ink and paint workers, who were all women. And of course, being an animation studio, the menus were decorated with fun cartoons. Here's a picture of the busy main commissary with its horseshoe-shaped counters. Walt Disney always wanted areas where everyone could relax and play ping pong, baseball, very much like a real college campus, the Disney archivist told me. They used the commissary as a shooting location for films like The Computer Wore Tennis Shoes with Kurt Russell, The Shaggy Dog, etc. During one of her visits with Walt in 1963, renowned Hollywood gossip columnist Hedda Hopper joined Walt at the commissary, noting, Disney employees were standing under the trees talking or sitting on the many benches that are scattered over his campus. Some were playing ball. Walt said, I used to have a baseball field and a putting green, but had to take them out and make parking spaces. According to Catherine Beaumont, the voice of Alice from Alice in Wonderland and Wendy from Peter Pan, Walt was a person who was quite visible. Walt would come down to the cafeteria and go through the line at lunchtime with his tray and find a place to sit just as everyone else was doing at lunch. He would visit with people. Here he is with the future president of Mexico, Miguel Alemán Valdez. And note the crackers in the center of the table and on the right, going through the cafeteria line, which he always had crackers and chili on all the Disney menus. Other stars you would find would include Julie Andrews, the whole Mary Poppins cast, Haley Mills, Annette Funicello, Fred McMurray, Shirley Temple, James Mason, and Kirk Douglas. In 1956, after television came into the picture and the Mickey Mouse Club took off, they added an executive dining room called the Coral Room for VIPs. Today, VIPs eat in the rotunda of the Michael Graves building. As far as the food, it was pretty basic. Walt Disney was famous for loving his chili, so of course the Disney commissary served it and still does. Disney's archivist told me Walt loved chili, stew, and tuna fish sandwiches. The cartoon specials for 45 cents included prime rib or lamb stew, which seems like a pretty good deal. There was also the Snow White special and the Little Pig salad bowl. I would have liked the olive, cream cheese, and walnut sandwich on the 1960s menu, which my mother used to make. A 1993 LA Times story mentioned the jalapeno cheese bread and chocolate chip cookies with walnuts as being some of the best dishes at the commissary. Kevin Feige, the head of Marvel, told the Hollywood Reporter that his favorite dish was the Mickey waffles. So even to this day, you can still get some of the the items that appeared on some of the earlier commissary menus, but I don't know if they still have the fun cartoons on the paper menus anymore. Moving over to Paramount, it's hard to say which studio was more glamorous during the golden age of Hollywood. MGM was certainly a contender, but Paramount's Cafe Continental seemed like the place to be right up until the 1970s at least. In 1941, Variety reported that Paramount had completely remodeled and redecorated the commissary, adding a private dining room and air conditioning. On the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a photo, a very early photo, with the amazing trio of Helen Hayes, Claudette Colbert, and Ruth Gordon in 1932. It's pretty amazing to realize these actresses started their career in the teens and were still working in the 1980s. Helen Hayes starred in A Farewell to Arms for Paramount in 1932, and Colbert appeared in several movies each year. Gordon seemed to be just hanging out, or maybe she was there to try to make a jump from the stage roles that she was doing at the time. Inside the Cafe Continental, there was a 7-foot-long table dedicated to Cecil B. DeMille, placed on a platform. They called it the throne, so he could look down on the people below. Here's Carol Lombard lunching with Clark Gable. Also note at the end of, if you can see at the very end of the photo of the room, the poster for VistaVision, which we'll come back to in a few minutes. Here's Marlene Dietrich and a later shot of Natalie Wood in the 1960s at a party for Love with the Proper Stranger with the director Robert Mulligan. The commissary was still pretty hopping into the late 60s and early 70s. Studio executive Peter Bart, who I used to work with at Variety, recalled, "I used to have my table next to John Wayne's, and Duke always had a steak for lunch. One day after lunch, I dropped by to say hello and gave him the book called True Grit and said, I'd like you to have someone read it or read it yourself because you'll enjoy it. That's what you could do then." And of course, he went on to make the movie. Peter also said during the time they were making Love Story, you'd have director Arthur Hiller and Ali MacGraw eating there because those pictures were shooting there on the lot. There'd be more of a tendency for the actors to actually be there. Now, of course, many films are made on location all over the world, and very few studio films are actually made in Los Angeles at this point. Here's more stars eating at Paramount. Angela Lansbury in the costume on the left, and an earlier shot of Cary Grant with Edward Everett Horton and Irene Castle on the right. Cary Grant got around. I guess he was just the most photographed star in Hollywood for several decades, so there seemed to be more photos of him available than anyone else. In this 1936 menu on the left, the menu was still large and elaborate. There were sweetbreads, Wiener Schnitzel, jumbo southern prawns, Newburgh en casserole. Alan Ladd was said to love the Spanish omelets. By 1956, the menu was a bit more basic comfort food, though they had added borscht and chicken chow mein. And that by then it was full of joke dishes and dishes dedicated to talent. There were English kippers and eggs a la Danny Kaye. The Dorothy Lamour salad had pineapple, bananas, cream cheese, and bar le duc, a very expensive red currant jelly. Dean Martin and Jerry Lewis were the studio's biggest comedians, so the menu had the Martin and Lewis special high-calorie diet, which was listed at $64,000. The 1956 menu on the right was signed by people working on 10 Commandments, so you can make out names like Anthony Quinn and William Holden in the signatures. The joke dishes included Jerry Lewis's breaded tweed jacket for $7 and a for real, very basic salad. In 1960, Modern Screen Magazine met up with Nick Adams, star of Giant, Wagon Train, and many TV westerns, in the Paramount commissary. The article observed some of the joke menu items, like the Jerry Lewis special breaded tweed jacket with almond sauce, as you could see on the other menu. Then Adams told the writer about the Rebel special, named for his TV series that he was starring in at the time. Basically, it's a plain omelet topped with a slice of American cheese and two links of sausage. Not very exciting. Meanwhile, strawberries Heston must have been a popular dish at the time because my mother often served strawberries with sour cream, only her version used brown sugar instead of honey, like in Charlton Heston's version. It was made with frozen strawberries. You would think you could have gotten fresh strawberries in Los Angeles at the time, but maybe they thought frozen ones were more accessible to their readers across the country. There was also turkey and eggs a la Crosby and Spanish omelet a la Alan Ladd listed in recipes in the magazine. TV producer Ryan Murphy is a huge fan of old Hollywood and often uses historic locations to shoot his shows. Sometimes he even recreates a piece of Hollywood history. In this case, the Paramount commissary for the recent Netflix show Monster about the serial killer Ed Gein. It's a grisly show, but there's a fascinating moment when Alfred Hitchcock meets with the novelist who wrote the book Psycho. They talk about how the book is based on the notorious murderer while cutting into a large steak. Notice in the background a poster for VistaVision, which possibly was inspired by the photo we saw previously of the actual Paramount commissary. VistaVision was a technology that was developed at Paramount. And you might not notice, but even the chairs are very close to photos from the original Cafe Continental at Paramount. He's a real stickler for detail, even though it looks like it was shot in a different room because I haven't seen that arched ceiling before. It was the 1941 Warner Brothers menu, which went viral a couple of years ago on the internet, that had started me off on this quest to discover more about Hollywood commissaries. Everyone is commenting on Twitter and Reddit with what dishes they would have chosen and wondering what certain items really were. The Warner's commissary was a big and bustling place, as seen in this vintage shot, serving the cast and crew of dozens of motion pictures every day. Like most studio executives, Jack Warner and his brothers and top executives didn't usually dine with actors, but they made an exception apparently for Al Jolson. At Warner Brothers, they were making some of the biggest classics of all time around the time that this 1941 menu came out. Casablanca, the Maltese Falcon, now Voyager were all in production right around that time. Here you see Betty Davis with her dog, another dog eating in the commissary, but at least it was not a chipmunk this time. And then Busby Berkeley dining with all of his dancers. Now at Warner's, we have Groucho Marx on the left with Danny Kaye, and then Ronald Reagan lunching with Olivia de Havilland, and then James Cagney with Rita Hayworth. I spoke with the commissary chief, Harry Dastian, at Warner Brothers, who said he was always happy when he would see stars like George Clooney, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Muhammad Ali, and Jennifer Lopez come into the commissary. So they still get some stars even today. The reason people got so interested in parsing that 1941 menu was because it was so huge, easily the biggest of any commissary I've seen, and included so many long gone items. World War II rationing was still a year away when this menu came out in 1941. And although the war was already raging overseas, for Hollywood folks, there were still delicacies like imported caviar, foie gras for 85 cents, oyster milk stew, and oyster cream stew, plus oyster pancakes. Main dishes included hot dogs with Liberty cabbage. We know it as sauerkraut, but like freedom fries, it had to change its name because of the German connection. You could also get hot chicken livers on toast or the manager's special sandwich of peanut butter, ham, and chicken on toast. On the side, you could order snowshoe potatoes, but I've never been able to find out exactly what snowshoe potatoes are like. Oh, hold on Just a second, we got a little off. There we go. To drink, there was buttermilk, but also a glass of half and half. Can't imagine anyone ordering that now. And sodas or juices called Mellow Paya, Papaya, and Lime Rickeys. For dessert, you could choose from a chop suey sundae, which was dried fruit and nuts in syrup, or the Vitaphone, the Warner Brothers Theater, or the First National. I have no idea what kind of dessert a Vitaphone would be. In 1962, the menu was much smaller, but you could still order tomato aspic or perhaps a secretary's light lunch of liverwurst sandwich and potato chips and sherbet for $1. Charles Perry, who I believe founded the Culinary Historians of Southern California, he wrote about the Warner's commissary in 1993 for the LA Times. You could start out with an impressive venison pate served on mixed greens with roasted garlic cloves and grilled shiitake mushroom caps, at least as good an appetizer as you could get in any San Fernando Valley restaurant, he told the LA Times. Okay, now on to Universal. The interesting thing about Universal Studios is that there has long been a public component attached to the studio. In fact, it was the first major studio built in Hollywood, and starting in 1915, guests were taken on tours of its large backlot. Excuse me. There were 2 restaurants which could serve 1,000 people in total. The commissary formerly had the slogan, "Dine with the Stars," and printed 250 extra menus a day to hand out to tourists. But with the advent of sound movies and World War II on the horizon, in 1939, Variety reported, with the funny Variety headlines that they used to have, "U folds its Gopper's paradise as look-see," which means the commissary was closing to people on the tour for a while. After that, they must have been pretty strict about who was allowed in, because in 1942, the extras complained to Variety that they weren't being served coffee at the commissary, even though others were being served, and the commissary manager made disparaging remarks about background players. So back then there was a real caste system, and the extras couldn't even get a cup of coffee. Also during World War II, Variety reported that the head of the commissary not only had to think about stretching rations, but was pressed into service as a culinary advisor for the restaurant scenes on the film Wake Up and Dream. After closing the commissary to outside guests back in 1939, by the mid-50s, things were not looking great after the introduction of television. To stir up publicity, Universal once again started allowing tour buses to drive on the lot and let people buy sandwiches in the commissary. Lou Wasserman asked the studio to create a full tour, which started out in 1964 as a 90-minute attraction, including a makeup show from the famous Mike Westmore in the commissary basement and a stop at the commissary for lunch. You can see the commissary in 1960 or so, how they had modernized with director's chairs, and Kirk Douglas signed one of them, and it was a kind of a more mid-century design, but with all their famous movie posters. Here on the left, Zazu Pitts appears in a very early photo from 1923, probably the earliest I've seen from any commissary. On the right, Ioannidis Cody, who is actually Italian, oversees a group of cowboy actors eating at the lunch counter. I think that's my favorite commissary photo. Here's a very nice 1960s Universal menu with a film sprocket design that featured Dwight's Special Sandwich, sliced sirloin, bacon, and marinated bean sprouts on whole wheat. I don't know who Dwight was or why he ate marinated bean sprouts with bacon, because that sounds a little strange. You could still get buttermilk for up to 30 cents a glass. And though the menu is undated, Fresca is available. So it was after 1966 when the diet soft drink was first introduced. When studio executive William Getz moved over to Universal from Samuel Goldwyn in the late 1940s, he brought his chef with him, who was famous for his apple cake. And everyone remembers seeing studio head Lou Wasserman holding court in the commissary well into the 1990s. Of course, there were several other important Hollywood studios. United Artists was located on Santa Monica Boulevard at what we now call Warner Hollywood. For breakfast in 1932, they served milk toast, buckwheat cakes, flannel cakes, and of course, all the menus had jelly omelets for many decades, which you don't see too much anymore. Sadly, Musso and Frank is not open for brunch anymore, so you can't get their flannel cakes, which were available for many years. Here's Shirley MacLaine laughing it up with Jack Lemmon and Billy Wilder during shooting of The Apartment at United Artists. And theirs was called Turner's Studio Cafe. At the Hal Roach Studios in Culver City, the Our Gang Cafe served up Eastern baby steer, Eastern oyster stew, tenderloin of sole, and East Side beer. A clipping named Sam Laurel's favorite dish as Yorkshire pudding. On the right is Rita Hayworth at the Columbia Commissary, which is where Gower Gulch is now on Sunset Boulevard in Central Hollywood. And last but not least, there were the favorite restaurants of studio employees. The Tam O'Shanter, which was so popular with the Disney folks when they worked on Hyperion Avenue that they actually called it the commissary. You can see on the right the original Tam O'Shanter building, which was built by Hollywood set designers and looked really atmospheric. And then you can see on top, if you've never been there, the more modernized version, but it's still exactly the same inside, and you can still reserve Walt Disney's favorite booth to sit at. And it's a really great slice of Hollywood history if you've never eaten there. Then the smokehouse, oh, I'm sorry, that's the smokehouse at the top, but the Tam O'Shanter doesn't look quite like it does in the bottom photo anymore. The Smokehouse was so beloved by George Clooney that he named his production company Smokehouse Productions. And I recently found out when I was visiting the Warner lot that there is a tunnel that goes underneath Barham Boulevard so that you can go directly from Warner Brothers Studios to the Smokehouse without even having to leave the studio or cross the street. But there was no one around to open the tunnel for us, so I didn't get to try it out at the time. So that serves as kind of a de facto commissary for people who don't want to eat on the lot. You'll still find many people from Warner Brothers eating at lunch and dinner at the smokehouse. Then there on the left, you'll see a beautiful menu for Nicodel, which shared the same block as the Paramount Studios on Melrose. And it had a wonderful cocktail lounge, which I'm sure was very popular with the studio folks because you couldn't usually get that many cocktails in the studio commissaries, although you could in some for those people who wanted the 3 martini lunches. Here's one more slide that I put in here just for extra credit because I love this building so much. It's called the Fred Thompson Building on Sunset Boulevard, which you might have visited as the Cat and Fiddle restaurant. Now it's called Superba Restaurant, and it still looks much the same. It was home at one time to the Mary Helen Tea Room, which was very popular with directors like Cecil B. DeMille, who worked at the famous Players Lasky studio at Sunset and Vine. He reportedly planned the 1923 epic The Ten Commandments at the Mary Helen Tea Room and lunched there every day, although it also had an earlier location closer to Vine. It was liked by the Hollywood crowd because it promised no gawpers, which was, I guess, sort of the version of paparazzi or fans that they have now. And wrapping up, in 1997, Variety wrote about commissaries. After a gourmet tour of studio eateries, however, one thing is clear. It ain't the chow that's important. When the tribe hunkers down for its daily repast, ritual and symbolism are the rule. Who goes to which lot, who sits where, and what kind of food are served, it's all about power. So that was how it was in the golden days. Not so much anymore. But we can relive those days through lots of movies and TV shows about old Hollywood, like Ryan Murphy's earlier series, Hollywood, which recreated a studio commissary and even sourced vintage chairs from the Warner Brothers commissary. You'll see on the left a clip of one of the vintage black and white photos of the commissary. And on this, in the still from the show, Hollywood, you can see that they used the exact same chairs. So again, he's just a huge fan of old Hollywood who wants to make everything as authentic as possible with his art direction crew. So that's about it for Hollywood commissaries. I'm going to turn on my camera now, and I would love to hear if anyone has any questions or wants to reminisce about anything they might have visited in Hollywood.